So, welcome to Midweek Experiments in Faithfulness. This is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice with a Quaker flavor and an experimental ethos. My name is Jen, and I'm the program manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House, where I live and work. The Friends House is a Quaker center for learning and action and a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values. And tonight we have Emily Ling with the practice Moral Bricolage. So we all inherit and are formed by a variety of spiritual, cultural, and relational values, and we all must reconfigure these ingredients of morals and traditions for our current life and times. In this introduction to the practice of moral bricolage, Emily will offer an invitation to reflect on how we may fashion creative and ethical beauty out of the bits of our own unique stories, so as to create a mosaic of spiritual grounding for our future journeys. Emily Ling lives and works in the intersection of spirituality, social justice, ecology, and creativity. She holds master's degrees in public affairs and divinity and worked for years in the field of criminal justice policy reform before embarking on her current job as a full-time farmer who engages regenerative agriculture to empower marginalized communities. So again, welcome. We're happy that you've joined us, and Emily, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's very exciting to be here with y'all tonight. So we'll just dive in. So the spiritual practice that I want to introduce to you tonight is something that I'm calling moral bricolage. It's essentially a practice of contemplative reflection about the state of all of our other contemplative spiritual practices and traditions, where we take time to examine the current state of what I would call our personal spiritual toolkits, which is the variety of spiritual practices and traditions that we have inherited or collected along the way, and that we use to approach life with. So moral bricolage helps us assess the toolkit that we currently have and to hopefully stay evolving that toolkit into a healthy way over time. And I should admit that I did make some assumptions about that if you're connected to the Beacon Hill Friends House, that you probably have at least some experience with spiritual practices and this whole idea of trying new ones every week. I was guessing you probably have some kind of robust spiritual toolkit that you use. To help explain this concept, I thought that I would first share what bricolage means itself in the art and engineering world. And it is a technique or creative mode where works are constructed from various materials that are available on hand. And it can also describe this process of remixing, reconstructing, and reusing various materials to produce something new. The phrase moral bricolage is a term that I was introduced to in a course in graduate school on ethical leadership. It was coined by Jeffrey Stout in his work on pragmatic approaches to developing ethical frameworks. But his definition is actually very academic. So what I have here on the screen is my professor, Walter Fluker's explanation of moral bricolage, which is that it is a creative process involving the inclusion, exclusion, and reconfiguration of the various moral traditions that make up the common life. So the idea is that we all approach life with a set of spiritual, cultural, and relational values that we inherit from our families, from our communities, and from society at large. Ethical leaders have to look at the landscape of the modern time that they are living in, and then they have to sort through the values and the practices that they've inherited. So they must decide what they need to keep from those traditions, what is no longer really helpful and might need to be left behind. And then they have to imagine how it all gets reconfigured together to provide moral leadership for the time and place where a specific person and community exists. And then I would also add one more step, which is to consider what might need to be acquired from conversations and experiences with other communities, because I don't think any of us with our inherited worldviews get all that we really need in order to be active, good global citizens navigating the modern world. So In the field of ethical leadership, moral bricolage isn't a spiritual practice, but I've thought about this concept a lot over the past year since I've taken that class. And I think it lends itself to something that could be a spiritual practice. So that's what I'm offering us here tonight to experiment with. It's an experiment of my own that I'm sharing with y'all. So my hope is that by periodically doing this kind of reflective practice, we can better be intentional co-creators with God of our life journeys, as we all fashion the random bits of our own unique spiritual stories into a work of art that is hopefully always fresh and beautiful and generative. So to do that, I'm going to walk us through a series of reflective questions, and I invite you to take a pen and paper, and you can either write or draw your responses to the questions that I'm going to lead us through. And I think it's helpful to approach this practice holding in mind a specific length of time, just so you're not actually thinking about your whole life, even though I think moral bricolage really is the work of a lifetime and would ask us to look at our whole lifespan. And you could also, on the flip side, kind of do this at a very micro level and ask these questions on a daily basis. And if you did that, it would become, I think, pretty close to the Ignatian spiritual practice of the examen. So if any of y'all are familiar with that. But for the sake of just getting a taste of this practice tonight, I thought we would, I'm going to suggest you think about the past 1 week of your life and think about that time frame when I ask these questions. And hopefully this all makes sense as we dive in. So the questions are going to have us reflect on 4 different approaches to our current spiritual life and state of spiritual practices: inclusion, exclusion, acquiring, and reconfiguring. So by that, I mean that we'll look at the parts of our current spiritual traditions and practices that we want to keep to include on our journey moving forward. The parts that it might be helpful to start excluding, the parts of our spiritual routine that might be lacking and which might require us to acquire some help. And finally, how to reconfigure all of those elements into something new. Within each approach, I'll explain a little bit more about each of those. And then I'm going to play some music, and you'll have a couple minutes to write down your reflections. The time for writing is actually going to be like pretty short, just to keep it in the time frame. So you can always go back later and give yourself more time to think through your answers. And nothing that you share obviously is going to have to be shared with the group later as far as the content. So if this is all still a little fuzzy, I did want to share a couple alternative metaphors that might be helpful to think about bricolage in practice besides just like art and engineering. So you might think of moral bricolage as imagining your current spiritual practices and habits as elements of trying to cook a fabulous meal. This is your life. You're trying to make a delicious meal. You've inherited a pantry full of ingredients, and you're going to need to sort through those and decide what you want to keep. You're going to need to see like what's expired and might need to be thrown away, what ingredients you might need to get from the store or from your neighbor, and then how you're going to bring all of those together in the right way to make a delicious meal that is good for you. Or you might think of moral bricolage as imagining all of your spiritual practices and habits as items within a backpack that you're taking on the long hiking trip of your life. You've inherited a pack that already has a lot of items in it, and you've already probably picked up quite a few of your own spiritual practices along the way. And you'll need to figure out which items you want to keep with you for the duration of this next season of life, which ones you might be better off discarding to make room for other stuff, which items of gear you'll need for the next section that maybe you didn't need before, and then finally how you want to rearrange all of that in your backpack so you can carry it with you on the trip. So hopefully it's helpful to have a couple other metaphors besides just the art. And now I'll start kind of diving into the actual practice. So our first area of reflection is going to look at what aspects of our current spiritual toolkit, so that's various traditions that you still are involved with, practices, spiritual habits. We're going to look at which of those that you've assembled so far would be good to keep holding on to as you journey forward. So I invite you to think back over this past week, whatever you might have experienced in the time since last Wednesday, and see if you can identify a moment when something that was passed on to you spiritually from either your family or your particular religious community, or maybe it's a spiritual teaching you've picked up along the way, when that something really helped you to create goodness in your life, or helped you to feel connected to the divine or to love other people. See if you can think back over your week and see how one of your spiritual practices helped do that. So yeah, we'll take another couple of minutes now and think back through the week and see if you have any of those moments that would maybe give you pause about whether that particular spiritual practice is something that you want to keep bringing along with you as you move forward in your spiritual journey. Well, kind of a classic one for me, it wasn't in the past week, but when I was thinking through this, is like, I grew up very conservative Baptist, and we always had the idea of a morning quiet time. And for years, it actually was really good for me. But then for a long time, I only did it purely out of guilt. And it actually wasn't particularly fruitful for me. And I kind of had to recognize, like, this was helpful at one point, but now feeling like I'm a bad person if I don't do this every morning is actually not helping me love God anymore. So things like that. And, that was kind of a long realization for me to come to, but maybe some things happen in a practice or a relationship where you're like, oh, this maybe used to be good, but now there's maybe some tension with it, or it feels more empty. So now we're going to go into the third section, which is acquiring. And we're going to reflect on things that might be missing in our spiritual toolkit that we're currently carrying, but we suspect we might need in the next season of life. So this step is actually straying some from like a true idea of bricolage, because in that principle, you just make with whatever you have available. But I think that, like I mentioned earlier, I think we can all acknowledge that even if we do like the best with the ingredients that we have, it's likely that we're going to need some new ingredients. We're going to need some new perspectives and some new materials to fashion what God is inviting us to create with our lives. So, and honestly, this one can be hard because a lot of times, like, we just don't know what we don't know until at some point it gets introduced to you. But I invite you to think back over the past week and see if you can identify a moment when you recognize that maybe you don't have the capacity currently to do something that you're wanting to do, or that you feel like God might be calling you to, or perhaps a moment when you became curious about learning something spiritually that you like just heard of and you don't really know, but you think, wow, that might be really beneficial to check out. So see if you can find a moment like that in this past week, when you felt a draw in some way towards maybe acquiring something spiritually that you're not really familiar with at this point. So give 2.5 more minutes and then we'll come to the final one. So reconfiguring. And so this is just briefly to think collectively about the last 3 sections, and to think about the things that you identified that you still really want to keep on your journey of spiritual disciplines that are serving you well. Maybe things that came to mind that you're wondering if they're still going to be useful for you to keep doing, or if you're having pause and continuing in maybe a particular traditional practice or something. And then maybe new things that you're curious about adding to your spiritual toolkit that are just still fresh, new ideas to you about God or church or community, and that you're curious about. And then see if you can imagine how these could be reconfigured together so that in the coming season of your spiritual journey, it might be one that's more healthy for you, or just more rooted in love, or you just feel more alive. And this one is like a really broad question, honestly. So if there is any kind of creative vision coming to mind just through kind of having walked through this reflective practice, want to give you a moment to just kind of like document what the hints of new possibility might be when you think about kind of just a reassessment and maybe a reordering of the backpack you're taking with you into the next leg of your spiritual journey. So give you a few minutes just if anything is coming to mind about that, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah, so that's about it. And this was totally an experiment for me. So happy now to hear any kind of reflection on how that was for you guys. And it's about kind of the end of the Camino de Santiago, which is this like famed pilgrimage. So it's all about the idea of like being on our spiritual journeys. And it was one of the pieces that kind of inspired this practice. So says, the road in the end, taking the path the sun had taken into the western sea, and the moon rising behind you as you stand where ground turns to ocean. No way to your future now, but the way your shadow could take. Walking before you across water, going where shadows go. No way to make sense of a world that wouldn't let you pass, except to call an end to the way you would come. To take out each frayed letter you brought and light their illumined corners, and to read them as they drifted through the western light. To empty your bags, to sort this and to leave that. To promise what you needed to promise all along, and to abandon the shoes that had brought you here, right at the water's edge. Not because you had given up, but because now you would need to find a different way to tread. And because through it all, part of you could still walk on, no matter how, over the waves. So thank you so much. It was a total delight to be with y'all tonight. I appreciate the invitation so much, and loved getting to do this experiment with y'all. So thank you.